So as you can imagine, there are four bearded guys on stage. So that means this is probably the Tolkien panel, and we're very fortunate to have these three gentlemen with us. I think they're going to go in order, but let me introduce them briefly, and then we'll get started. Jake Grefenstette, have I got that right? Yep. Grefenstette works on Samuel Taylor Coleridge's literary and theological legacy from Newman to Geoffrey Hill. Originally from Pittsburgh, PA, my hometown, Jake has studied theology, philosophy, literature at Notre Dame, U Chicago, Peking University. Is that really the Peking University? Beijing. In Beijing? Oxford and Cambridge. He's just completed his doctoral dissertation at the Faculty of Divinity at King's in Cambridge. So welcome back. Dwight Lindley is Barbara Longway Briggs Chair in English Literature at Hillsdale College, where he teaches courses in great books and in 19th and 20th century British literature. As a 19th and 20th century British literature guy myself, no shortage of good material. He has published articles on Austen, Newman, Hopkins, Dickens, Virginia Woolf, and others, and is now completing a book that gives a philosophical and theological account of the literary act. He lives with his wife and 9 children in southern Michigan. And last but not least, we have Jonathan Geltner, who studied English classics and French at the University of Cincinnati, pursued graduate work in English at the University of Chicago, earned an this is a long list, earned an MFA in fiction from Warren Wilson College, published a translation of Claudel's 5 Great Odes with Angelica Press in 2020. He's written a novel, published from Slant Books, a new novel, 2022. He teaches creative writing at Eastern Michigan up the road and is fiction editor for Slant Books. Is that a reference to Tell the Truth but Tell It Slant? Or? Fiction editor for Orison Books. There we go. His current project, Romance in Apocalypse, is concerned with the quest for re-enchantment among a variety of authors and places. So each of our speakers are going to regale us with their thoughts for about 15 to 20 minutes apiece, and then I hope we'll have some time for questions. So, great. Why don't you take it away, Jake?
Okay. Okay, can you hear me okay? Thank you very much for the introduction. Is it working well? All right. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you all for coming today. My name is Jake Grefenstette. Thank you especially for my sister-in-law for making the trek over. I'm going to be talking a little bit today about a trio of figures often not spoken of in the same breath, Lewis, Harold Bloom, and Tolkien. Tolkien is sort of going to haunt the background. The sort of premise of the talk is Lewis and Bloom walk into a bar, which sounds like a joke that would make 3 people in the world laugh, but it's a historical event that is not really commented upon. So I'm really just going to focus on this really discrete disagreement they had. But just to begin, a few questions. I imagine everyone here has heard of Lewis and has read some Lewis. I'm biased. I have a daughter, Lucia, a dog, Frodo Waggins. Harold Bloom is probably less obvious. Is there anyone here who has not heard of Harold Bloom? Okay, yeah. Yale University Press advertises him as the most famous literary critic in the English language. That means very little. My 14-year-old cousin, I think, has reached a broader international audience on TikTok. But in his world, he's a famous figure and famously anti-Inkling. One of his students coined him as the anti-Inkling. Here are a few things he has to say about the Inklings, which usually characterize the way we think about Bloom on them. I suspect that Lord of the Rings is fated to become only an intricate period piece, while The Hobbit may survive as children's literature. He said this as recently as 2008. He passed away 2019. On Lewis, he's even harsher. He says, in Narnia, Lewis whacks the reader with a Christian cudgel on nearly every page. Granted, this is something Tolkien may agree with at times, but he continues, he goes on to call Lewis the most dogmatic and aggressive person I have ever met. Towards the end of his life, he compares C.S. Lewis to Donald Trump. And whatever we think of Lewis, whatever we think of Trump, I don't think there are many of us who would make that connection. So this is how he's construed. He's no friend to Christian theology. Lee Ozer's book, Return to Christian Humanism, the index for anti-Christian authors, there's one sub-entry, and it's Harold Bloom. So this is the context. Lewis responds to Bloom in one location. This is the second to last academic publication that Lewis makes, is a review of Harold Bloom's 1961 The Visionary Company, a reading of the Romantics. He says, Bloom's book is one of the most difficult I have ever read, 10 times harder than Aristotle. In such cases, vanity whispers that the fault lies with the author. So this is a matter of record. What's less well known is that the two were actually briefly acquainted. In 1955, Lewis took up a chair famously at Cambridge after Oxford had denied him a chair. And this was the year that Lewis was doing his Fulbright Fellowship from Yale to Pembroke College, Cambridge. At the time, Bloom looked up to Lewis. He was one of the few people who was working seriously on the Romantics. They went to a pair of pubs, which were likely, if this is an important question for you as it is for me, likely the Pickerel Inn and the Anchor in Cambridge. And they had several meetings. Bloom recounts that they quickly realized they meant different things by Shelley, which basically meant they had a disagreement over the nature of the creative imagination. Bloom offers one recounting of this experience in a volume he edited on Lewis's works. I found no one reads this volume of that Bloom edits on Lewis's work precisely because why would you? He's clearly no fan of Lewis. So this is sort of something that's just hidden in plain sight. But he says, the breaking point of our pub conversations was the metaphor creation, which Lewis insisted pertained only to God. There was no trace of creativity in Shakespeare, Dante, Cervantes, Lewis told me. The greatest writers only rearranged building blocks provided by God. If, like Blake or Shelley, you had the illusion that you were creating, what you actually created was hell. On that, as on all things, C.S. Lewis was firm. So this is the single passage I'm going to talk about. I'll repeat it one more time, and I'll open it up. If anyone briefly wants to suggest maybe where Bloom has gone wrong here. This is recounting the episode 50 years later. I mean, he's being quite unfair to Lewis. I think this is the point. So one more time. The breaking point of our pub conversations was the metaphor creation, which Lewis insisted pertained only to God. There was not a trace of creativity in Shakespeare, Dante, and Cervantes. The greatest writers only rearranged building blocks provided by God. If, like Blake or Shelley, you had the illusion you were creating, what you actually created was hell. On that, as on all things, Lewis was firm. Anyone want to venture sort of, do you think that's a fair characterization of Lewis? Anything jump out to you as misrepresenting him? Yeah. Yeah, so he is this etiolated vision of what Lewis thinks of, as God's creation. That's correct. And any other initial thoughts?
Yep. I think under a certain very specific notion of the word creation, I could very well imagine Lewis saying that. And if there's any unfairness to it, it would be the unfairness of, I'm sure there were further qualifications made about what literary and artistic creativity entailed.
Yes, so Bloom is absolutely correct that the kind of creation Bloom has in mind, creation out of nothing, Lewis and Tolkien, Orthodox Christians, apply this solely to God. But if we read Lewis on creation, he has a much higher view of creation. He actually uses the language that Bloom uses here. So Bloom talks about Lewis thinking that poets only rearrange building blocks provided by God. He's alluding, and it's clear in context, he's alluding to Coleridge here. Coleridge's famous distinction between imagination and fancy. Fancy being the rearranging of things dead, fixities in the world, and imagination as the thing which generates new images. So the background of all this is Tolkien's idea of subcreation, which I won't define in positive terms, but in negative terms is something that is greater than this idea of fixities, a mere rearranging of fixities in the world, but at the same time less than creation out of nothing. So Lewis and Tolkien don't want to blaspheme, but they still rate the activity as the poet, as after Coleridge, being a kind of echo of the creative act. Okay, so Lewis's view of creation becomes clear when we look at his initial review of The Lord of the Rings that comes out in 1954. He writes, "Not content to create his own story, Tolkien creates the whole world in which his story is to move, with its own theology, myths, geography, languages, and order of beings. This delivers a comparable sense of reality unaided, a radical insistence of what its author has elsewhere called subcreation." So the key phrase here is a comparable sense of reality unaided. He's not blaspheming. He has his notion of divine providence firmly in place. This is not a creation which divorces itself from God, yet neither is it the mere sandpit of fixities that Bloom attempts to reduce it to. The irony is that Lewis, who speaks of a comparable sense of reality unaided, might well have agreed with Bloom's designation of the poet's creative act as itself a kind of metaphor or echo, as after Coleridge, who speaks of the primary imagination as the repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of the creation in the infinite I am. So both models represent ways of privileging the creative act in Lewis and Tolkien without infringing on the territory of creation out of nothing. Okay, so this far I think this is uncontroversial. Lewis's notion of creation is much nobler than Bloom has it. The more controversial claim I want to make is that Bloom himself has a notion of poetic creation which very nearly approximates to Lewis's. So Harold Bloom is famously very hard to classify. He begins his professional career among the deconstruction crowd at Yale, but he says he can't stomach the distinguished linguistic nihilism of Paul de Man, and yet the theological alternative is equally distasteful. So he equivocates. In his famous early essay, The Breaking of Form, he says, "Whether one accepts the theory of language that teaches the dearth of meaning, as in Derrida or de Man, or teaches its plenitude, as in Barfield or Ong, does not seem to me to matter." This is funny, but more than funny, it's remarkable that in the 60s, he's citing Owen Barfield, one of Lewis's closest friends, a fellow member of the Inklings. And indeed, he continues to cite Barfield throughout his career as one of his major influences. So there's a lot to be said about this relationship between Bloom and Barfield. I'll only sort of gesture here to the genealogy of that influence. Barfield is known as the philosopher of the Inklings. Tolkien and Lewis attribute a lot of their notions of what poetic creation is to Barfield. This is a matter of record. What is not a matter of record is that Bloom does the same. And I won't trace this history, but I'll sort of skip to the end where it finds its fullest expression. In 1998, Bloom's work on Shakespeare's Adventure of the Human, he has this passage which quotes implicitly Barfield a few times. He says, "A weak misreading of Shakespeare might contend that Shakespeare's originality was in the representation of cognition, personality, and character. But," and this is in contradiction to his earlier claim 40 years prior, "there is an overflowing element in his plays, an excess beyond representation that is closer to the metaphor we call creation. The dominant Shakespearean characters, Falstaff, Hamlet, Cleopatra, are extraordinary instances not only of how meaning gets started rather than repeated, but also of how new modes of consciousness come into being." So there's he's not quoted, but two of these are directly from Barfield. The language of an excess beyond representation and the inauguration of new modes of consciousness in poetry. So Bloom continues to write, "Hamlet represents a dramatist's apprehension of what it means to incarnate the tragedy one cannot compose." This notion of the poet doing an incarnational activity or something that's an echo of the incarnation is something that follows from the Barfieldian understanding of Coleridge. And Barfield saw in both Lewis and Tolkien, especially in Tolkien's notion of subcreation, something which doesn't infringe upon, is not blasphemous against the incarnation, but is doing a sort of tropological work. It's turning our attention towards the incarnation, which is, as in Barfield words, is the thing which undergirds all poetic activity. Incredibly, towards the end of his career, Bloom doubles down on this incarnational understanding of the creative imagination. So capacious is Shakespeare's effect upon us, he says, that we have no secular similitudes to be offered as alternatives. So Barfield finds himself in a difficult position. He initially refers to himself as a Gnostic heretic. Towards the end of the year, he settles on the phrase transcendental atheist. So he has these commitments which bring him towards the Inklings, but he's clearly not willing to hop on the train of what he calls the neo-Christian moralizers. But his mature, that is to say, in the last 2 decades of his life, theory of poetic creation draws almost every time he speaks of the creative act, he invokes language of the incarnation. He gave a lecture at Yale in 2012 on Shakespeare, and he cites Barfield sort of obliquely, and it's probably not clear to the crowd that Barfield is someone of significance. Barfield was a lawyer at the time, so he says, I spoke with my friend and attorney Barfield. It's probably not obvious that he's actually going on to quote a bit of Barfield here, but he delivers this remarkable passage. Shakespeare's recognition of the human was an act of literary knowledge, a mode concerning which we still comprehend rather little. Falstaff, Hamlet, and Cleopatra are transactions in knowledge. The ancient Greek word for word, logos, in its root means a gathering together. The Hebrew davar for word is also an act and thing, which derives from a root meaning to thrust forward something that has been held back in the self. When I listen to Falstaff or to Hamlet, I hear that bringing forward. What we learn from Shakespeare's vital men and women is the knowledge they incarnate. The self-awareness of Falstaff, Hamlet, and Cleopatra is the salient quality that renders them endless to contemplation, ours and their own. So Bloom tries to skirt the Christian resonances of this line by identifying himself as a Gnostic atheist. His famous language is that of the daemon or the demiurge. But this actually comes from Barfield as well, who in his poetic diction speaks of a certain unconscious daemonic element which is especially pronounced in poetry, arguing that he would plead in extenuation that it lies in the nature of poetry to be always straining towards a plenum of consciousness, which is another line that Bloom paraphrases. So Bloom's demiurgical notion of the subcreation of literary characters represents in his mind a transposition of Coleridge's relationship between the divine and the human to the relationship between the author and the author's characters. So he speaks of Hamlet being incarnated and quotes Hegel, who says Hamlet is real enough to contemplate himself as a work of art. Bloom understands this transposition as a way of speaking in theological terms without committing himself to any genuinely Christian claims about the incarnation of the Logos. And yet all the Inklings would see this approach to literature as being precisely what they're doing. Bloom misunderstands what poetry is meant to be for the Christians and the Inklings. He thinks that by threading this needle between fancy, or the rearranging of fixities, as Coleridge would have it, and creation ex nihilo, that he is doing something antithetical to Christianity. But this is precisely the needle that the Inklings are trying to thread. As Christian theorists of literature, the Inklings are fundamentally interested in how we can speak of an excess beyond representation, which is at once more than a mere rearranging of building blocks, and yet less than the different in kind act of divine creation. So Bloom's attempt to identify himself as a transcendental heretic by rejecting creation ex nihilo in the poetic act, therefore only brings him closer to the Christian Coleridgean account that we find in Lewis or Barfield or Tolkien. The great irony here is that Lewis and Tolkien probably would have supported Bloom's poetic formulation of poetic creation as itself a kind of metaphor. Okay, that's all I have to say in this talk. The last note I'll add is that in the series of essays that Bloom edits on Lewis, he reminds us, and this is something he publishes very late in his life, the only reason he has continued to read Lewis throughout his life is because of Barfield. Bloom claims to have read all of Lewis's fiction at least once and all of Lewis's scholarship at least twice, which I think is more than most scholars of Lewis can say. Most of Bloom's former students and friends I've spoken to insist that Bloom is lying here, and I think it's clear from his description of Lewis that he maybe hasn't even gotten as far as mere Christianity. But the remarkable thing to take away here is not that Bloom has misrepresented Lewis, but that Bloom's notion of the poet comes from Barfield, and this brings him much closer to Lewis than he would have been comfortable acknowledging. Okay, thank you very much.
Good morning. Happy to be here. And this is a talk I'm calling Personifying the World. At the end of his short work on prayer, the North African theologian Tertullian wrote something surprising about non-human animals. The whole creation prays, he said. Cattle and wild beasts pray and bend their knees, and in coming forth from their stalls and lairs, look up to heaven, their mouths not idle, making the spirit, or breath, spiritus, move in their own fashion. Moreover, the birds now arising are lifting themselves up to heaven, and instead of hands, are spreading out the cross of their wings, while saying something which seems like a prayer. Aside from its rustic beauty, the interesting thing about Tertullian's description, to me, is his willingness to attribute to beasts what is usually considered a human intention. When barnyard animals look up and bleat or whinny, they are acknowledging God, he says. When birds fly in cruciform, crying as they go, they make their offering. But we, skeptical moderns and postmoderns, might ask, what is really happening when Tertullian sees the birds praying? Is he really telling the truth about them, or is this a projection of himself and his categories? If he is truth-telling, what difference does that make? I have begun with this kind of florid 1800-year-old image, but I think this is also a question for our own quotidian life and time. Can I tell the truth about you, or this lectern, or the building that we're in, or the institution of Notre Dame? And if so, what is happening when I do that? And in response to these questions, I want to advance a series of 4 theses. 1, we can tell the truth. Bold claim. 2, to tell the truth is to participate in divine creation, so there will be a nice connection to the previous talk here. 3, at the heart of creative truth-telling is a literary figure, personification. 4, personification is our path to sanctity. No comment. That was probably me, though. To get at the first of these, return for a moment to Tertullian's birds. The doubt in our post-Cartesian, post-Kantian heads is whether he is seeing what he wants to be the case, or perhaps overlaying the instinctual behavior of a brute animal with a salutary moral meaning. And I will admit, I think the first time I read this, that passed through my mind. Well, that's kind of nice. The birds are praying, but you know. Salutary moral meaning. Who knows what birds mean by flying and making noise? But it's certainly edifying to think of it as prayer. But to think thus is to presume an abyss, a defining breach between my life as a thinking, speaking animal and the unspeaking modes of existence occupied by other creatures. Yet, as recent work by Peter Wohleben Rowan Williams, Catherine Pickstock, and others, has suggested, there are good reasons to think of non-human creatures, both in nature and in the constructed human world, as communicating or speaking in their own ways. I'm thinking of this remarkable book by Peter Wohlleben, The Hidden Life of Trees. If any of you have ever seen this book, it'll surprise you. Obviously, the vocalizations and other signature sounds of non-human animals carry meaning, from the mating invitations of whales to the flight patterning calls of geese to the warning rattles of diamondbacks. The sounds that they make are signs, and signs can be interpreted, told as truth. The rattle of that snake's tail means keep your distance. Of course, though, animals also make silent communications of various kinds. But these overt, instinctual gestures, along with vocalized communication, are only the tip of the iceberg, for we may also speak of the logos of creatures simply being there. This is a kind of language we can find in finite beings, animal, vegetable, mineral, or composite. Everything that exists is what it is in relation, which is to say that it stands in a specific tension with the other things around it. As Ishmael says toward the start of Melville's Moby Dick, there is no thing in this world that is not what it is, merely by contrast. Nothing exists in itself, close quote. Because they are fundamentally relational, one bird will behave differently if another bird is nearby. Not to mention a predator, of course. A sapling that grows up near a full-grown tree will develop differently because that tree is there, and its growth will further vary depending on whether the mature tree is a sugar maple or an oak or a conifer. A boulder or rock face, furthermore, is what it is in relation to the wind and weather of its location, resisting decomposition in specific ways and at a measurable rate. Even the man-made desk on which I wrote this paper, full disclosure, I wrote this in my walk-in closet. There's a little desk in there. A strange fact about me. So even that desk that I wrote this paper on pushes down into the carpet of my walk-in closet with a specific force, the two physical objects defining themselves in relation to one another. This way of being toward others in all finite things is a communication of specific information, and the communication, we know, is heard, inasmuch as it changes the modes of being of those around it. This is all to say, finally, that organized communication, or logos, is not uniquely human, but basic to being as such, so that my words about that tree or this bird need not be impositions. Truth-telling on this account is something always already happening around us. Human words fit organically into this picture as we express in a different way what things are already saying. Our language, as Jean-Louis Cartier once said, gives voice within itself to the polyphony of the world. Now, my second thesis is that the uniquely human way of truth-telling, our logos, is an active participation in divine creation. This has certainly been the intimation of many romantic and post-romantic thinkers in the last 200 years. In the late 18th century, the German poet and philosopher Novalis thought that the world is always, as it were, waiting for humans to complete it. Quote, "We and it are integral halves," he said, and we complete it precisely by romanticizing it in language. By endowing, this is a quote, "By endowing the commonplace with a higher meaning, the ordinary with mysterious respect, the known with the dignity of the unknown, the finite with the appearance of the infinite, I am making it romantic." Famous description from Novalis. As William Wordsworth wrote a few years later, the sun seemed to become more itself in his poem, The Prelude. And as Rainer Maria Rilke intuited early in the 20th century, our minds are somehow necessary for the full becoming of things around us. What birds plunge through, he wrote, when they fly, is not simply the air, but also the terrain of our perception and imagination. And there, in the, quote, intimate space of the mind, in which you see all things intensified, the bird's flight most fully comes into its own. But what can such a claim mean? To get at what makes Wordsworth or Rilke's vision possible, we need to venture into the metaphysics they both presumed, but they did not investigate. Broadly, it is Christian Platonic, and I would even say Augustinian. A view of reality according to which creatures are most themselves, inasmuch as they relate to their creator. The model comes clear at a climactic moment in Confessions, Book 10, where Augustine moves through the creation, asking each type of creature, "Tell me of my God. You are not he, but tell me something of him." Then all creatures lifted up their mighty voices and cried, "He made us." My questioning, Augustine adds, was my attentive spirit, and their reply, their beauty. Interrogatio mea intentio mea, et responsio eorum species eorum. Right at the point where each creature's species, its particular beauty or specific form, stands forth most clearly, that is where it declares, with the logos of its being, the name of the God who made it. In other words, for Augustine, when a thing is most beautifully itself, it is most connected to God. And conversely, when a creature is seen in God, or perhaps narrated into God, it becomes more fully itself, as Rilke understood. To tell the truth about a thing is to see it in God, as God sees it, in some sense. And by that very fact, it must be a participation in the divine creation. For the return of all creatures to their creator is the work of God par excellence, and a work he accomplishes through our mediation. So to the extent that we use our words to give voice to the things around us, we are being let in on the work God is always and everywhere doing. Now, for my third thesis, it is that personification goes to the heart of our creative truth-telling. At the outset, I think it's possible to miss quite how important personification, what the Greeks called prosopopoia, to miss how important it is to our understanding and speech. But if the late philosopher Robert Spemann was right, it's actually impossible for us to approach other creatures at all without presuming some degree of likeness between us, or at least as a starting point. Quote, "If we want to do it justice, we have to view non-human life anthropomorphically," Spemann said. "For otherwise, how would we begin talking about it at all?" Quote, we are able to speak adequately," Spemann said, "about unconscious non-human life only on the basis of the conscious life that we ourselves are. We do not have any direct access to non-human life. We can only think of it as conscious life minus the consciousness." What he is saying, then, is that we necessarily approach other things with the presumption of likeness, think Tertullian, looking up at the birds, but strip away the attributes that do not seem to be relevant to the other species. We often do this without even thinking about it. We identify with something, start describing it, we're letting the kind of irrelevant differences fall away. Strip away the attributes that do not seem relevant to the other species. Birds seem to have drives for hunger, mating, and so forth, but they do not have my consciousness, my capacity for rational reflection on those drives. To get at birds at all, I must presume some sense of what it is like to be a bird, and I do that by thinking analogically of its overlap with myself. The same is true, Spemann thinks, even of inanimate objects such as rivers or rocks. To get at what they are, we identify them with ourselves, moving and solid beings that we are, but strip away an even greater number of human and animal attributes. In practice, this means that personification is the natural starting point for human truth-tellers. In giving voice to things around me, as Augustine did in the Confessions, I attribute to them something like agency, some sort of teleological drive, and a basic kind of intelligible action even. Any speech would show this, but let us take an example from one of the great personifiers in the history of fiction, Charles Dickens. And I literally turned open almost randomly to a page and from Dickens, who I'm teaching a class on right now, and just chose this. So in his novel Bleak House, he describes one character as living, quote, in a pretty house, formerly the parsonage house, with a lawn in front, a bright flower garden at the side, and a well-stocked orchard and kitchen garden in the rear, enclosed with a venerable orchard wall that had of itself a ripened ruddy look. But indeed, everything about the place wore an aspect of maturity and abundance. The old lime tree walk was like green cloisters. The very shadows of the cherry trees and apple trees were heavy with fruit. The gooseberry bushes were so laden that their branches arched and rested on the earth. The strawberries and raspberries grew in like profusion, and the peaches basked by the hundred on the wall. Close quote. In giving the house a front and a side and a rear, as we typically do with houses, right? Dickens implies an orientation toward the street, a point of focus and directionality for the house that is not unlike the frontward sense that humans necessarily have of their own bodies. The ripened, ruddy look of the orchard wall gives one a sense of long experience and perhaps joy or some other emotion, while the heavy, arched, resting, basking fruit trees all suggest various sorts of lovely but exhausted action. Everything bears an analogy with its human viewer, and as Dickens shares his life with these lesser creatures, he lifts them up into the light of a greater intelligibility. They're not humans, but they stand forth in his speech as enhanced versions of themselves, becoming somehow more of what they already are or were. That is to say, when Dickens or Rilke or any of us speaks of other beings as sharing human life, that sharing is a way of bringing them into God, lifting them up through analogy into clearer contact with the ground of all analogy, the Creator. In personifying the birds and lowing cattle as praying, Tertullian saw them in direct relation to the core of all reality. This brings us to my fourth thesis. Personification, and this is my last paragraph, I'm bringing it in for landing. Personification is the human path to sanctity. Obviously, the vocation of every person is to God himself, which, well, I say obvious, obviously in this room at least, I say. The vocation of every person is to God himself, which means that we are all called to holiness of life. At the most basic level, this means that all our life, every object of our attention, needs to be brought, perhaps dragged, into relation with the divine. And if speech, and especially personification, are some of our most important ways of doing that, then they must be part of the path to heaven. By sharing my life with the things I address and deepening the analogy between us, which I also take it as, of course, God's action towards us, right? This is a way in which I think we're made in God's image, as we were made to share our life with the objects of our attention. As we do that, deepening the analogy between us, I participate in their continuing creation, lifting them up into the divine life to which we are all called. JeanLouis Cartier thought of this, and here he's following the French poet Paul Claudel, thought of this as the arc of speech, in which we, like Noah, raise all creatures above the devastating flux of time, bringing them with us into the beautiful clarity of God's own eternal life. But the mystery is that even as we elevate others, we ourselves are also being elevated. For to lift other creatures into God is to praise. As Paul Claudel wrote in the third of his great odes, and here I'm quoting from Jonathan's translation, a beautiful translation of this text. As Paul Claudel wrote, "Free her, the earth, by my mouth, with this praise I owe you." So his praise is going to free the earth. His freeing of the earth through words is going to praise. There is only one arc of speech, and it is the Logos of God. When we creatively lift all that touches us into it, we will find ourselves in the ark as well, carried ever deeper into the depths of being. Thank you.
Yeah, here. But that's where
All right, greetings. Good to be here. My first time at Notre Dame, as a matter of fact. I'm so sorry for my terrible cough. I promise I'm not a vector of contagion, but I just hope to make it through the paper here without too much mishap. So these ideas, what I'm going to read is called Fiction and the Spiritualization of Matter. My driving question today is this. What does an author of fiction do in a philosophical or ontological sense, and why does he or she do it when describing the natural, or what I would prefer to call the given world? What I've assembled here is not really an argument so much as a series of questions and suggestions, a tapestry woven mostly of the words of others, words which live together in my mind and seem to belong together to reveal something in their juxtaposition. So I'm going to start out with 7 quotations here. Just bear with me. So first, I want to consider what kind of a writer of fiction begins a book this way. Number 1. 20 years ago, when I first arrived on the plains, I kept my eyes open. I looked for anything in the landscape that seemed to hint at some elaborate meaning behind appearances. Or it begins like this, number 2. When the waves of the Aegean parted and the mountain of Lesvos began to emerge from the depths, damp, shining, and serene, the waves were astonished to see the island, their new friend. They were used to traveling from the regions around the Sea of Crete and breaking on the shores of Anatolia. All they knew of dry land were hard mountains, gigantic cliffs, and yellow rocky land. But this new island, was something different. How very different it was, and that's why the waves said, let's take the news to the nearest land, to the land of Aeolia. Let's tell it about the island, the new land that married light with serenity. Or like this, example 3. Above the wagon rolling along a stony road, big thick clouds were hurrying to the east through the dusk. 3 days ago they had inflated over the Atlantic, had waited for a wind from the west, had set out slowly at first, then faster and faster, had flown over the phosphorescent autumn waters, straight to the continent, had unraveled on the Moroccan peaks, had gathered again in flocks on the high plateaus of Algeria, and now, at the approaches to the Tunisian frontier, were trying to reach the Tyrrhenian Sea, to lose themselves in it. Beginning of novel number 4. For the greater part of its course, the river Drina flows through narrow gorges between steep mountains or through deep ravines with precipitous banks. In a few places, only the river banks spread out to form valleys with level In a few places only, the riverbanks spread out to form valleys with level or rolling stretches of fertile land suitable for cultivation and settlement on both sides. Such a place exists here at Visegrad, where the Drina breaks out in a sudden curve from the deep and narrow ravine formed by the Butkovo rocks and the Uzavnik mountains. The curve which the Drina makes here is particularly sharp, and the mountains on both sides are so steep and so close together that they look like a solid mass, out of which the river flows directly, as from a dark wall. Then the mountains suddenly widen into an irregular amphitheater whose widest extent is not more than about 10 miles as the crow flies. These all keep going in their description. I'm cutting off after only a few sentences. Here's number 5. One arm of Lake Como turns off to the south between 2 unbroken chains of mountains, which cut it up into a series of bays and inlets as the hills advance into the water and retreat again, until it quite suddenly grows much narrower and takes on the appearance and the motion of a river between a headland on one side and a wide stretch of shore on the other. The bridge, which connects the 2 banks at that point, seems to make the change of state still clearer to the eye, marking the spot where the lake comes to an end and the Ada comes into being once more, though further on it again takes the name of a lake as the banks separate, allowing the water to spread out and lose its speed among more bays and fresh inlets. And since I love rivers, being a Cincinnati man, one more in that vein. The city of Passau is situated on the upper part of the Danube. By this city, the river has flowed from Swabia and Bavaria and waters one of the southern exits of the Bavarian and Bohemian forests. This exit is a steep and mighty cliff. The bishops built their upper house on this cliff, a mighty fortress to defy their subjects if the need arose. East of the upper house is another rocky crag crowned with a smaller building. This one belonged to nuns, and for that reason is called the convent, a gorge with raging water that from above looks black as ink, separates the two crags. This is the river Ilz, flowing from the Bohemian Bavarian forest, sending its brown and black waters to the Danube. Here it unites with the Danube, causing the water along the latter's northern bank to be a darker ribbon for a considerable distance downstream. And finally, consider this. What kind of a book begins this way? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the face of the waters. The description continues, but I think you know how it goes. So, leaving aside that seventh and final example, the books are in order: The Plains by Gerald Murnane, Land of Aeolia by Elias Venezis, The First Man by Albert Camus, The Bridge on the Drina by Ivo Andrić, The Betrothed by Alessandro Manzoni, and Vitico by Adalbert Stifter. It's a historical novel. It's fantastic. Bears comparison with Kristen Lavren's daughter. There are several ways of meaningfully answering that question: what sort of a writer would begin a work of fiction in this way, by evoking landscape? Two characteristics I'd point out now are formation in a sacramental Christian culture and modern or postmodern historical situation. Most works of fiction do not begin in this manner. Most, whether long or short, prose or verse, and indeed whether modern or pre-modern, begin with the human world, with a character, a family lineage, a city, dramatically in scene, etc. If they begin in the voice of a character narrator, that voice will usually be self-referential, as in my first example, but not, as is the case in the first example, immediately concerned with a landscape. There are important differences among my examples, of course, and the way a book of fiction begins does not necessarily entail much about how the story will go or how it will be told. But I do think that the beginning of a book of fiction tends to signal something fundamental about the disposition of the author, his or her basic intentionality toward the world, and the double sense of will and of perceptual consciousness. In my last example, the Bible, the author is held to be the author or creator of the world in question, namely this real world. But does this not apply to every author? Is not writing, especially the writing of fiction, the creation of a world? Perhaps a new one with each book. Or then again, perhaps all fictions coincide in one world which both is and is not this world. Such is the opinion of the author of at least one of my examples, Gerald Murnane. There is, I think, a very great difference between modern and pre-modern writers vis-a-vis the landscape, the earth. I've been wondering lately whether there is any landscape description in the literary sense, the way it appears in the first 6 examples in the Bible. You could call this gratuitous landscape description. Wow, can't say that. A description undertaken purely for the sake of the intrinsic qualities of what is described, and not to participate in allegory or any other rhetorical trope, which includes metaphorical and symbolic discourse of all kinds, and anything dictated by literary conventions, such as the tradition of pastoral or Georgic poetry, the medieval hortus conclusus, the enclosed garden, or the locus amoenus, the pleasant place. In the Western tradition, such gratuitous description is almost, if not entirely, absent from literature prior to the modern period. It is also mostly absent from the Bible, much as the book of books overflows with imagery from the given world. But it is not absent from the beginning of Genesis, and also, I think, not absent from God's answer to Job, or from the Song of Songs, and there may be other places that you can think of. The short of it is that when God is speaking directly of his creation, he is surely not being rhetorical, for his word is the creation. In a similar way, the fiction writer's word is, in the deepest ontological sense, his creation. The author will perhaps at times feel, unlike the absolute ground of being himself, that she is the mere conduit by means of which this word can be uttered and this world, or some humble corner of it, brought into being or revealed to be. Nevertheless, there is no other term for what occurs than the act of creation. But if this is the case, then in what sense can we say an author of fiction describes this already extant, already created, very real earth? Rather than call what the author of fiction does creation, Tolkien, as we've already heard, in his seminal essay on fairy stories, coined the term subcreation for the process and the truth of what goes on in fiction. But he was speaking there of what we now call fantasy literature. It's easy to think of fiction as another world if that world is patently not this one, but an invented world or some quite skewed and unconnected version of this one. However, with all 7 of my initial examples, that is not the case. The first idea I want to suggest is therefore the counterintuitive notion that all fiction comprises a single world, which both is and is not this world, and that God is the maker of that world as surely as of this one, as Tolkien states in his essay. My second suggestion follows from this. If a writer of fiction takes up some portion of this real, or as Tolkien put it, primary world, and inscribes it in her fiction, then that portion of the world is transfigured. I have a phrase from Vladimir Solovyov that seems it could denote this process, the spiritualization of matter. I'm afraid that's all the more I'm going to say about Solovyov, though, after getting my title from him, because his thought is incredibly large and complicated, and I haven't unraveled it all. And his use of that phrase, the spiritualization of matter, is sort of undergoes changes. And if anyone knows more about Solovyov than I do, that is to say, please help clarify things later on. I said just now that this transfiguration or spiritualization is not much or at all present in pre-modern literature, and I believe that is so because in order to describe, evoke, and finally transfigure a world or any part of it, one must feel alienated from it. The biblical worldview, which posited man fallen with the whole creation, still did not admit a radical division between man and creation. That division is the source and the burden of our objective modern perspective, but it is also hidden blessing. For as the authors I've cited, and many others attest, we have now the opportunity for a deliberate spiritualization which our more enchanted ancestors may be said to have lacked. There has never been a better time to imagine our way back into the creation myth in Genesis and those other portions of the Bible where God's perspective on his creation is revealed. And I think that if it is indeed possible to reveal God's perspective on his own creation, I think that is at one and the same time revealing the creation. It is a kind of apocalypse. Solovyov's intriguing phrase resonates in my mind with Tolkien's closing words in the essay on fantasy, and I would simply substitute fiction for fantasy in this paragraph. So here's Tolkien. Redeemed man is still man. Story, fantasy still go on and should go on. The Evangelium has not abrogated legends, it has hallowed them, especially the happy ending. The Christian has still to work with mind as well as body, to suffer, hope, and die. But he may now perceive that all his bents and faculties have a purpose which can be redeemed. So great is the bounty with which he's been treated that he may now perhaps fairly dare to guess that in fantasy, or just in fiction, he may actually assist in the effoliation and multiple enrichment of creation. All tales may come true, and yet at the last redeemed, they may be as like and as unlike the forms that we give them as man, finally redeemed, will be like and unlike the fallen that we know. So that's Tolkien. What he means by at the last redeemed here is quite likely what Murnane means when he discusses in various parts of his oeuvre the idea of being able to view the world of fiction from its far side, the country on the far side of fiction, as he puts it. And for the necessary groundwork, so to speak, for these ideas of the spiritualization or fantastic transfiguration of the earth, I look to Sergis Bulgakov's notion of the whole earth having become the Holy Grail, when blood and water, bodily human life, both the flesh and the soul, as Bulgakov understands it, spilled from the side of Jesus on the cross. Well, appropriate solemnizing. He writes in his essay on the subject that the Holy Grail, I quote, abides in the world as the mysterious holiness of the world, as the power of life, as the fire in which the world will be transfigured into a new heaven and a new earth. For the church, the body of Christ, is not only the community of the faithful, but also the whole universe in God. Even as the human being is a microcosm and the world is an anthropocosm, so the realm and power of the church extend to the entire universe. All of nature thirsts for the body and blood of Christ and receives them in communion in the blood and water that flowed out of his side when he was on the cross. And Bulgakov notes, furthermore, it is not surprising if this mystery, till now still not illuminated by the theological dogmatic consciousness, has lived only in the obscure presentiments of Christian legend and poetry, in which the holy myth is clouded by human imaginings, by romantic reveries. But at the appropriate time, this mystery can take center stage in the Christian world's consciousness. So, if what Bulgakov says is true, then how should we not be always blessing, praying ceaselessly when we are in the midst of the given world? I would like to finish by quoting two masters in whose work we can see exactly this happen. Both authors are Catholic. First, a few moments from the Austrian Adalbert Stifter's 1845 novel, The Bachelors, and then from Norwegian convert Jon Fosse's recently completed masterpiece, Septology. So the orphaned youth Victor, on his way to his uncle's isolated estate on an island in a mountain lake, is in a boat with two locals taking him to his final destination. This is in The Bachelors. At last they reach the green water, where the massive trees on the island plunge to their reflection into the lake water, penetrating its depths. Then across from Hool, the little bell hanging between the four posts rang out for evening prayers. The two rowers immediately shipped their oars and quietly said their evening prayers, while the boat thrust forward as if of itself, alongside the gray rocks that descended from the island into the lake. Here and there on the surrounding foothills, the light played deceptively. The lake had even acquired stripes, some of which shone and even threw up flashes, even though the sun had set some while earlier. Across all this came the continuing and diligent ringing of the bell, rung by invisible hands, as it were, since Hool could no longer be seen, and around the lake there was not one spot that even from a distance might seem like a human habitation. In the novel, Victor is a pious young man. That's why I think the narrator tells us a little earlier, when he's on his way over the countryside, that he was surrounded by thousands of creatures rejoicing. The example of the local villagers, though, may have improved even Victor's piety, for the next morning, I quote, in the passage it struck him that he had forgotten to say his morning prayers that day for the first time. It must have happened as a consequence of the huge and unprecedented impressions he'd been affected by that morning. Yes, the landscape all around him. He returned to his room, therefore, went and stood at the window again, and spoke the simple words he had once secretly thought up for this purpose, and which no one knew anything about. Then he set off a second time in search of his uncle. So that's it for Stifter. Jon Fosse's novel is a stream of consciousness book in the voice of an older painter named Asla. It's a doppelganger story in which there's another Asla. It's a really complicated book. Once the point of view Asla was married to a woman named Alice. The names are just anagrams of each other. It's tricky. And Alice wrote holy icons. I believe that's the correct phrase, right? We say we write icons, interestingly. She wrote holy icons and read Meister Eckhart with Asla. In his dying days, and the dying days of the other Asla, who has drunk himself near to obliteration, in Advent, in the west of Norway, the landscape is about all that is left of the present world that Asla is conscious of. Alice had died in youth from a sickness, and they never had children. Asla has a landmark which grounds his prayer and grants him access to his deceased wife and other memories, and visions of his past, of the other Asla, and the other Asla's past as well. So I'm just going to read a few of these. These are from different places in Septology. It's an incredibly beautiful book. I can't do justice to it. These are by no means the most beautiful passages, but they just happen to be examples of exactly what I'm talking about here, where consciousness merging into the landscape is bound up with either or both of prayer and a certain visionary, fantastical capacity. So it's stream of consciousness, there's like no punctuation, just roll with it. Now she is everything that exists in language, because God is the pure, the whole language, the language without division and separation. Yes, something like that can be said too, Alice says. And then she says that it won't be long before we are indivisibly together in God, the two of us together like we were on earth, but in God, Alice says. And she can't tell me what that's like because people can't picture it, Alice says. And I say that I'm tired. And Alice says, I can go lie down. Yes, I need to, she says. And I sit in my chair and I look at my landmark in the water near the middle of the Xenia Sea, look out at the waves, and Alice's voice goes away. And I hold the cross on the rosary tight, and I see words before me, and I say inside myself, Pater Noster, qui es in cielo. There's more prayer in this book than, I think I can say this without fear of contradiction, any work published in a European language, a work of fiction anyway, that I've ever heard of. He's constantly launching into prayer like this, in Latin, as often as not. The sea is always there to be seen. Yes, I can see all the way out to the mouth of the fjord and the open sea. Yes, I see the Xenia Sea and the islets and reefs out there, the holms and skerries and the islands protecting the mouth of the fjord. And then I see the spaces between the islands where it opens out, and you can see the ocean itself, yes. Even if it's dark and snowing hard, or a heavy rain, or there's fog, I can see the water, the waves, the ocean. And it's impossible to understand, actually, I think, as I sit there in the chair at the round table, and I take my bearings, and I look at the spot I always look at in the water, and I see Asla standing in the hall outside the classroom. This goes into memories like this, but he sees his memories. It's this stillness that is God's creative silence, as Alice used to say, because God is an uncreated light, she said. And I've experienced myself that the black darkness is God's light. This darkness that can be both in me and around me. Yes, this darkness I now feel that I am. Because in the darkness is a stillness where God's voice sounds in silence, I think. And I see the chair where I always sit next to the round table, and I go over to the chair and I sit down and I find my bearings, and then I look at my landmark, at the waves. And I think that often when I sit like this and look at the water, I pray a silent prayer, and then Alice is near to me, and my parents, and my sister Alida, and the grandmother, and Ziegfa, and I get very still inside. And I think that everyone has a deep longing inside then. We always long for something, and we believe that what we long for is this or that, this person or that person, this thing or that thing. But actually we are longing for God, because the human being is a continuous prayer. A person is a prayer through his or her longing, I think. And then I look at the chair next to me and I see Alice sitting there, and then she starts singing softly, almost inaudibly. She sings Amazing Grace. And I sit on my chair and look out at the fixed point on the Xenia Sea like I'm in the habit of doing, and I notice that Alice is sitting here next to me, and she's holding my hand, and I think that, yes, really, it was the night before I went to Berven with my pictures to try to get into the art school that my grandmother died, I think. And then I hear Alice say, your grandmother's in a good place now. And I feel that Alice is so close, so close. She's sitting in the chair next to me, and I can feel her hand in mine so clearly, and I look at the chair, and of course I don't see anything. And I let go of Alice's hand, and then I put my arm around her shoulders, and I look at the waves, and I see Asla and Liv, and she has a big belly. I sit in the chair here next to the round table, and I look at the same spot in the water, in the Xenia Sea, and I have my arm around Alice's shoulders, and I think that I should have said a prayer for Asla, and then I collect myself, and then I pray for God to let Asla get better. And if he can't get better, then for God to take him into himself and give him peace. Take him into his kingdom, God's peace, God's light, I pray. And I look at the waves, and I see Asla. So, yeah, that's enough, I think, for Fossa. But by way of a very unscientific concluding postscript, I will just say that I believe Bulgakov was right when he wrote that, quote, once one has seen the Holy Grail, it is impossible to forget it, and it is impossible not to take communion from it. This describes my own experience as a boy. I lived and I played, which is to say lived in story, in a fantasy world which was at the same time most assuredly the real green world all around me in southwestern Ohio, the outdoor given world in which I was most content in all seasons and weathers. And my fantasy was always quest, as fantasy must be, and quest is always quest for the Holy Grail, for the ultimate desideratum. What I instinctively knew as a boy, an instinct that adult learning has not improved upon, was that this is true of fantasy, which I can never extricate from the earth, because this green given world is the Holy Grail, that in which we live and move and have our being. But I think we must always be reminded of this. This may be the liturgy, the common work of story, of all art, to remind us of the Holy Grail. All right, so, thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you, gentlemen. We have time for questions. It's 10:06. Why don't we start with here and then here?
Especially after the lecture last night, I don't know if you attended, but this panel was really rewarding in combination with that lecture, and I learned so much just now. Just one quick comment. It seems, Dwight, with your paper that one of the things that you're getting at is the way in which beauty as property of being is this disclosure of existent form, and so therefore at the root of being is, as you said, it's the relational, that being is always giving itself away. I want to ask a really kind of basic question of Jake, though, just and maybe this was part of your argument, and I just was too slow to follow it all the way, but could you say that there's actually, Bloom is doing a little bit of Bloomian misprison on Lewis? Because isn't the whole premise of the anxiety of influence that you really are just working with dead blocks of fixity, and that the anxiety is that you try to conceal that from yourself, or rather the romantic poet conceals that from himself? Is that fair?
Sure, yeah, great question. So for those who are unfamiliar with Bloom, probably is, or if you are familiar with him, you're probably familiar. His sort of his 5 texts in the middle of his career on this notion of the anxiety of influence, this notion of misreading, which isn't taking teaspoons for tablespoons, but is the way that living authors deal with their own belatedness, how one misreads or sort of creatively reinterprets Shakespeare to make room for yourself and the tradition. So yeah, it's a really good question. Are these monuments of tradition, as Eliot calls them, things which are inert and dead, or are they something that are alive? Is that the?
Well, but also that I mean, for Bloom, the romantic, the visionary poet is still really manipulating the blocks of matter that are the great monuments, and the anxiety comes from the effort to conceal that from himself, right? So, I mean, is there? Do you think there's a genuine creative vision in Bloom that's antithetical to Lewis and to a sub-creation idea?
I tend to think that that Bloom does have some sense of. I mean, when he speaks of this excess or overflowing of meaning, there's when Agnes Fletcher died, who Bloom was close to, he writes about how Fletcher brings him to this idea that he also finds in Barfield of the imagination as a holy fire. So I think that there's something sort of beyond the fixities that the Bloom has in mind. I think this is why he struggles to sort of describe himself as a transcendental heretic or agnostic atheist or something like this.
Were you asking, James, whether Bloom is anxious about Lewis's influence?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I wrote down during your talk.
I think that's absolutely true. And Bloom actually wrote a novel, which is terrible. He disclaims it. That has been read as Bloom's anxious attempt to come to terms with Lewis's success as a fantasy writer. But yeah, I think that's, broadly speaking, I think that's absolutely correct to say that Bloom is so sort of cruel towards Lewis precisely because they're so close. He's dealing with the anxiety of influence. Thank you. This gentleman.
Hi, Ben Conroy. I've always loved Tolkien's piece on various stories, but I've always had kind of a question about it, which is, it seems like the Tolkien's right, like the vocation of being a storyteller, a fiction writer, or a poet, it almost seems like it would be one of the most lofty vocations, you know, most closely approximating God's creative act as a human. And yet in Christian history, you don't really find storytellers, fiction writers, poets being, you know, so highly honored compared to other people. I'm just kind of wondering, is Tolkien overstating his case, or are there other ways, other than this particular way that we can kind of participate in sub-creation, that Tolkien's identifying a particular example of it, but it's a more general category? I can go to anybody.
As a writer, do you feel this great vocation?
Yeah, maybe 1% of the time. I mean, anyway, so you're saying, you know, does it have to be verbal art in order to subcreate? Do we need language? Do we need the logos in order to be really subcreating, or however one wants to put it?
It could be a question about language, and it could be another question about like art in general.
Yeah, because I mean that seems to be the distinguishing factor there. You need language to create, to do world building, as we call it now. But Tolkien in that essay, I mean, if you remember this thing better than I do, help me out. But he actually, he's still making distinctions even within literary art as to what really counts as subcreation. And interestingly, I think one of the things he says is not really fantasy or subcreation, is drama, theatrical representation. He talks about that as an enchantment, in a kind of negative sense of being able to trick your viewer, and the way that works. And this is true of maybe certain modes of realist fiction, but certainly anything on the screen. The way moving visual representation works is it tricks you. You pretend that it's actual. You pretend that it's real. There's no storyteller. There's no narrator. And so it just works as a pretense of actuality. And Tolkien finds that to be enchantment. It's a form of magic. It's spellbinding. But what he's interested in subcreation is something that's storytelling. And I think that, to me, that as the years go by, that becomes a more and more important distinction to me. There's storytelling, old-fashioned fiction, and or poesis. You know, in the defensive poetry, Philip Sidney in the 16th century is defending poetry, but it's fiction too, it's story. There's that, and then there's what Tolkien calls enchantment. There's drama. I don't want to sound like a puritanical guy who wants to shut down the theaters or something, but there is an interesting distinction there that in the age of the moving image on the screen, we might need to take more seriously. He wrote that essay in the 30s, I guess. So before, obviously there was cinema, but before TV. Anyway, that's an interior distinction there that is maybe worth.
I mean, I had a related thought. I mean, as Jake would know better than the rest of us, I mean, Coleridge himself thinks of this participatory creativeness as first in the imagination, just perceptively. And I think that's really common throughout the Romantic tradition. Novalis in Germany thinks the same thing, that you're already painting with your imagination, he says. And then this kind of second movement of it is kind of outward into language or another medium.
We have time for one more question, this fellow here.
Yeah, Mr. Geltner, so you spoke of to transfigure the world, we have to be detached and removed from it, right? And you spoke of that sort of as a quest, but wouldn't it be better to have like an implicit daily transfiguration of spiritualization of matter, which I think would kind of be words detached from the world?
I don't know. It might be, but because we don't live in that world, I can't say. And I guess I'm just always trying to find a way forward. We can't go back. We're not going to inhabit what Lewis called the discarded image again. It just doesn't work that way. So I'm trying to find a way to think about the alienation or detachment or division that I think is kind of our birthright, regardless of individual or even group conviction, but just like the background radiation of the world we live in, the culture we live in. I'm trying to find a way to put that to good use, I guess. And it just occurs to me that, you know, you don't actually get gratuitous literary description in the world you're talking about, the world of daily enchantment or symbolic meaning everywhere, precisely because it's not necessary. They don't need to do that work of transfiguring things. It's just, it's there, it's the background radiation. But maybe we can get to a new version of that on the far side of whenever the modern epoch finally...
We get to that far city.
Yeah. The country on the far side of fiction. I mean, but I don't, I do think it's important to be honest about the world we actually live in, and not, there's much talk of re-enchantment, but I think it won't happen unless we fully understand just how unenchanted we really are.
So one last comment, and we can continue conversations, of course, afterwards, because there's a break coming up. But the one of the things that has been delightful about this conversation and hearing from these papers is that we not only heard good papers and good passages, but we also had signs and wonders, lights flashing, voices from the other room that we couldn't see. This was great. So even praise, you know, praise that is constant. The focus here has been on the literary act, and I noticed, just as an observation, that a lot of what we've been focusing on is the writer at work and what the nature of that act and how it's related to things. But one of the things that Bloom talks about, too, in his effusions about the poet Wallace Stevens, is that the reader becomes really important. And then when we work with metaphor, we're also inviting the reader into a participatory act, which then opens up the conversation to communion. And I would encourage us to continue to think along those lines as well. We also didn't talk a whole lot about plot. We talked a lot about description, but it's also interesting to think about plot in relation to these kinds of questions. So I think what these papers have allowed us is for us to continue the conversation outside where we can get some more coffee. Thank you all for coming.